Hello everyone, I'm Mike Ward and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. In this series, we are currently looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and the numerous challenges that it is posing to the healthcare industry. And we're looking at how business leaders are actually managing those challenges. So in line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by Gil Van Bokkelen, who is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Athersys Inc, a publicly quoted clinical stage biopharma company that's headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, and is focused in the field of regenerative medicine. So underpinned by a stem cell technology platform, Athersys is discovering, developing, and manufacturing therapeutic programs targeting neurological, inflammatory, and immune indications. The company's off-the-shelf stem cell product, Multistem, is currently being evaluated in several clinical programs, the most advanced being a phase 3 clinical trial for treating stroke patients. However, after showing some promise to treat patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, the company has just started enrolling patients in a phase 2, phase 3 study of COVID-19 induced ARDS. So Gil, I hope you and those you care about are keeping well, and thanks very much for joining me.
Oh, thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So firstly, what have been the most immediate impacts of the pandemic on your company and its employees?
Well, it's really like many other companies. It's affected us operationally at multiple different levels in the organization. So first of all, we had to shift gears and modify the way we were doing a lot of things. So a lot of work is being done remotely. People that can work effectively from home are strongly encouraged to do that, while we're trying to maintain a conservative approach to minimizing physical interactions with one another while the numbers and the pandemic continues to grow and spread. Fortunately, there was a lot of technology available that we had in some cases already implemented, and so we were able to make a pretty good transition to accommodate the current reality, which is trying to work effectively remotely and minimize large group gatherings or face-to-face meetings on things. I think that internally within the umbrella of Athersys as a whole, we've actually, I think, adjusted quite nicely to the things that we had to modify in order to be able to keep rolling along and keep advancing our key programs and our efforts. Outside of Athersys, we've also been impacted in the sense that many of the hospitals that we work with have been fundamentally hampered by what's going on in COVID-19. So our clinical focus, as you had alluded to earlier, is really in the critical care space. So whether it's patients that have suffered a debilitating stroke or patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome or some of the other critical care programs we have, our focus from a therapeutic standpoint in the advancement of our off-the-shelf cell therapy Multistem is to treat patients that are in the hospital. Frequently they're in the ICU and are in really bad shape. But many of the hospitals and their ICU operations have been fundamentally impacted while COVID-19 has emerged and continued to grow and spread. And that's because they've had to devote a lot of their internal operational resources and their ICU beds and everything else to just dealing with the fundamental aspects of that crisis, that pandemic and the associated problems. So unfortunately, many hospitals have had to limit the clinical trial participation or their operations that are devoted to other clinical trials that they've been involved in. And that's become a widespread phenomenon and has become a bit of a problem. Thankfully, the FDA has actually been very accommodating in terms of working out practical solutions to help companies continue to advance their clinical programs. But operationally, it's been a big challenge for a lot of hospitals. In fact, some cases, hospitals have had to shut down their participation in ongoing clinical trials. In other cases, they've had to limit their participation in new and emerging clinical trials. So it's had a widespread impact for many, many companies, for many patients, obviously, and for many programs. So that's been a bit challenging.
So specifically, is there anything that you've been able to do to sort of mitigate, that risk in your own sort of clinical trial advancement?
Yeah, we have been able to do some things. So as I said, the FDA has been very pragmatic in terms of allowing companies. So for example, if you have a requirement for follow-up visits in the conduct of a clinical trial, most trials, in fact, very few trials, I would say, had anticipated the need to do some of those visits remotely, as opposed to doing them in the doctor's office or in the hospital setting or whatever it might be. And so the FDA actually had to develop a perspective on how were they going to allow companies to do some of those follow-up visits or some of the things that needed to be done in a way that allowed programs to continue, clinical trials to continue, while at the same time preserving the integrity of the data and of the process as a whole. But I think that the FDA has done an excellent job in that regard. Many hospitals have done an excellent job in that regard. Some hospitals are still trying to figure it out. And I think that that everybody's trying to adjust to that constraint or that set of constraints. But obviously, we working with our CROs and in the various clinical trials that we're focused on, and our key opinion leaders and clinical experts have made adjustments about how certain things can be done. And I think we've done a very good job of that. But the reality of it is that some clinical institutions are still impacted by what's going on. And so they've had to either scale back or even in some cases temporarily suspend their participation in clinical trials just because all of their resources are being devoted to, or a substantial amount of their resources are being devoted towards dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic.
And do those delays in any way kind of compromise the sort of, the protocol that you originally agreed?
Yeah, they don't really compromise the protocol. Basically what it does is it forces companies to adjust their timing on things. So obviously, if you're planning on having a certain number of clinical sites up and running in your clinical trial, and your ability to either get those sites up and running, or in some cases keep those sites up and running because they've had to temporarily suspend their participation in certain clinical trials, then that strings out your timeline. So you have to adjust to that from an operational perspective. We've already stated publicly on multiple occasions that our timeline is going to be impacted for example, for our stroke study or other studies that we might be involved in, and we're adjusting to that. At this point, I think it's still a little bit too early to tell exactly what the impact will be on some of the clinical trials we're running. We're still working with some of our clinical partners to adjust to certain types of things, but I think that this is commonplace now among many, many, many companies in the industry that are struggling to deal with the ramifications of COVID-19 and their efforts to continue to advance their clinical programs in a constructive way. So there's really no major adjustments to the protocol per se, but as I said, some of the follow-up visits or the way those visits or assessments are actually conducted, that's changed a bit because some things that can be done remotely are being done remotely. And I think that's a reasonable path for companies and the FDA and the clinical institutions to take.
Right. And how has sort of social distancing stuff impacted your ability to actually make the sort of stem cell products?
Yeah, well, thankfully, our contract manufacturing partners have done pretty well operationally. There has been some impact from time to time, particularly earlier on during the crisis. But I think that lately, actually, things have progressed pretty effectively. And I think that these companies have done a good job of adjusting their own internal operations and the way that they address certain types of things operationally. So we're grateful for their continued support and their hard work at allowing us and supporting us in terms of our efforts of keeping advancing in our core clinical programs.
Right. So before we talk about your efforts to help COVID-19 patients, it'd be great if you could just sort of describe the platform that actually is underpinning your clinical programs. The Multistem.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So basically, we work with a special class of stem cells that are isolated from healthy consenting donors, and the donors that provide us with the starting material for our product are typically in their mid 20s or so. They're healthy consenting subjects. They undergo a full health evaluation, medical evaluation, and the cells that we obtain from these donors are a special class of cells that have some very unique properties. Namely, most people and most of your viewers are aware of the the history and the concept of traditional bone marrow transplantation, where for every one patient you want to treat, you have to find a matched donor that basically has the same tissue type, and that you can, as safely as possible, take material from that healthy donor and transplant it into the cancer patient that needs that bone marrow transplantation, typically following radiation therapy or chemotherapy, which wipes out the blood and immune system. That's not a very scalable process. That has been practiced. Actually, the original bone marrow transplants were done in the late 50s and early 1960s. And so many patients over decades have actually benefited from that early work that was done. But again, that process is not very scalable, because for every one patient you want to treat, you have to go out and find a matched donor. And in some cases, you have to search through many, many, many potential donors before you actually find a donor that is a suitable fit or a suitable match. In some cases, for people with rare tissue types or other constraints, you may not even be able to find somebody that's an appropriate match, and that's obviously not a good situation for anyone to be in. Our technology is actually at the opposite end of the scalability spectrum. So the special class that we work with, which are referred to as multipotent adult progenitor cells, can be isolated from bone marrow. They can also be isolated from other tissue sources, but bone marrow is how we do it clinically and for the production of our product. But once we take a small amount of material from a single healthy consenting donor, we can actually grow these cells up because they have very unusual growth properties. Unlike traditional bone marrow, for bone marrow transplant purposes, those cells can't really be expanded. The cells we work with can be expanded. In fact, we've shown we can grow them up in very large scale, and we can produce the equivalent of millions of clinical doses with a modest amount of starting material from a single healthy consenting donor. So in essence, what we've figured out a way to do over many, many years is take this special class of cells, grow it up using a variety of state-of-the-art biomanufacturing techniques and technologies. And the other nice thing about the cells that we use that essentially comprise our product is that we can administer them just like type O blood. We don't have to tissue match. We don't have to immunosuppress the patients that we're trying to treat. So it combines the very powerful combination of scalability in terms of being able to produce a lot of material from a single donor and do that in a very careful, diligent, very thorough kind of way, and also to administer the product in true off-the-shelf form. In fact, our cell product is literally stem cells in a vial, which are maintained in frozen form, and they can be administered very simply and efficiently when needed. All you have to do is remove the vial from the freezer, thaw it, and then transfer it into an IV bag of saline, that stem cell solution. And so the nice thing about it is that we've been able to combine what we believe are the ultimate in scalability with ease of administration, and that also couples with some other very important aspects of the product, which is the fact that these living cells are dynamically responsive to things that are going on in the body. So when the body is in trouble, when there's a problem, whether it's from a stroke or an acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the leading cause of death among COVID-19 patients, or other programs where we've shown, for example, in trauma, where we've shown the ability to actually have an impact. These cells can home to sites of tissue damage, inflammation, and injury, and dynamically respond to what's going on in the body to downregulate the hyperinflammatory activity that might be occurring, which is very problematic and prevents the patient or can limit the patient's recovery. And at the same time, stimulating key reparative mechanisms that help the body heal and the patient recover much more effectively than they might necessarily be able to do on their own. So it really is a powerful combination of several different things that we're attempting to utilize and focus on these critical care indications that are all significant areas of substantial unmet medical need, and where we think we can have a substantial difference in benefit for patients.
So you mentioned that the cells, they sort of get to the site where there's a problem. What is the sort of the mechanism of action? I mean, what are they upregulating or downregulating?
Yeah, well, so first off, in some cases, they do go to the site of action where the site of the injury is. In other cases, they may go to other key organ systems that are really playing an important role in the body's response to that initial event, whether it be the stroke or the injury or whatever it might be. And it gets directly to the mechanisms of action. So the nice thing about these cells is it isn't just one mechanism of action, it's actually a whole series of mechanisms of action, which we've come to understand and really deeply be able to characterize after many, many years of work with dozens of outside independent expert labs across a variety of different disciplines. So let me give you a couple of really important examples. So one of the things that we and other labs, other research teams discovered going back a few years ago is that the immune system plays a fundamental role when certain types of events happen in the human body. A really good example is when a patient suffers a debilitating stroke. Turns out that when somebody has a serious and devastating stroke, the brain starts signaling to other parts of the body, specifically to the immune system, and one key component, which is the spleen. Spleen actually acts as a repository or kind of a warehouse, if you will, for immune cells. And most of the time, those immune cells are just sitting in the spleen, not doing anything. They're waiting for a signal or a set of signals that we hope never get sent, because those signals only get sent when something really bad just happened and the body has been compromised in some way. But when a patient has a stroke, two signaling cascades start to activate the peripheral immune system and those immune cells in the spleen. And basically over the first couple of days after the stroke has occurred, it triggers a massive hyperinflammatory response, because essentially the immune system thinks the brain or the body is under attack, if you will. Well, that hyperinflammatory response is essentially a hyperinflammatory tidal wave, if you will, can have devastating consequences in the brain, because the brain and the central nervous system does not like inflammation. When those immune cells get mobilized and they leave the spleen a couple of days after the original event, they head up to the brain, they cross over into that area where the stroke occurred, and then they create this very hostile hyperinflammatory environment, which results in the expanded loss of brain tissue that might otherwise be rescued or saved if that didn't happen. Well, one of the things that we know Multistem does is that when we administer the cells, within 36 hours or less of when the stroke has occurred, we have lots of evidence that shows that the cells actually, many of the cells go to the spleen, they downregulate that emerging hyperinflammatory cascade before it gets out of control. And at the same time, these cells start stimulating key reparative mechanisms, so specific cell types like regulatory T cells or M2 macrophages or other cell types that are really playing a fundamental role in helping clean up the damage and actually initiate some of the key reparative processes that are very beneficial to the patient's recovery over time. And the way that they do that, which we've documented and characterized extensively, is through the regulation of a whole range of cell types and key biological pathways that we know that these cells dynamically react to, respond to, and regulate. So in contrast to a traditional drug, like a traditional pharmaceutical, which is designed to do a very specific thing, one very specific thing, or say an antibody, which is also designed to bind to one very specific target or antigen. These cells actually do a whole series of things, which makes them very, very powerful. And that's one of the reasons why we believe they've shown such promise in dealing with things like stroke, with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and some of the other indications where we've done an extensive amount of work.
Okay. I mean, just sort of one follow on. One of the advantages, of course, if you're very, very specific in your target, is that's where the sort of the drug is actually having an effect. Whereas if there are sort of potential sort of multiple targets, is there not a sort of a danger that you could have sort of off-target effects, which means that the patient actually will maybe sort of suffer some other sort of reaction to the drug that wasn't expected?
Yeah, well, we've not seen any evidence of that. We've conducted years and years of preclinical studies in a range of different models. The interesting thing about these cells is they're innately biologically wired to follow the cues that the body is emitting, saying, hey, there's a problem here. We have an issue and we need help. And then these cells basically respond dynamically. Now, it does beg the question, so one of our clinical programs that we recently got authorization from the FDA for is in treating trauma patients, where the same thing that happens with stroke actually happens in trauma patients, where the patient undergoes a serious trauma. It actually initiates that hyperinflammatory response. And based on the preclinical work that we've done and what we believe we'll be able to show in our clinical trial, is that when we administer Multistem, we can downregulate that hyperinflammatory cascade. and actually upregulate the key preparative processes and mechanisms that will help the body recover and deal with that event that just occurred. And we're not thinking about this in the context of only one specific type of trauma. We think it could be generally applicable to trauma that occurs in these types of situations. Now, you raise kind of an interesting hypothetical question, which is, hey, what if somebody had a trauma and had a stroke, right? What would the cells do? Well, the kind of the cool thing biologically is the mechanisms in terms of the body's response are actually pretty common to both of those situations. The first thing is to launch this massive hyperinflammatory response. And we also know that stimulation of these key repair pathways, whether it's a stroke or whether it's a trauma, so stimulating some of those cell types that I talked about earlier, or stimulating some of the other pathways that we've characterized, we believe that those are central to and beneficial in terms of the patient's recovery and repair over time. So the multidimensionality, if you will, of the mechanisms that these cells are dynamically responding to and helping to regulate, it's not being done blindly. It's actually being done in the context of what is happening in the human body at the time. And so we think that that is a very appropriate thing, and frankly, one of the ways where we can actually maximize benefit and maximize recovery. Now, that's very different than what we've done historically with traditional drugs, where you give the drug, it binds to a specific receptor, it does one very specific thing, and if you aren't able to achieve therapeutically what you need to through the regulation of that one specific target or that one specific thing, well, then you have to do something else, right? So the fact that these cells are responding dynamically, I think there's lots and lots of evidence to show that that's a really good thing. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why we've been able to have an impact in some very challenging clinical indications like stroke, like ARDS, other places where, frankly, standard of care hasn't changed much in many, many years or even in decades in some cases.
And in fact, I mean, Athersys was working on an approach, to ARDS or to treat patients with ARDS, before sort of COVID-19 emerged. What had you seen previously that had given you confidence that it might be useful, and what progress have you made on that front?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, like many companies, we started working in animal models, and we started working in animal models of acute lung injury, and working with some leading outside independent labs that were well positioned to use their many years of expertise, in some cases decades of expertise, and animal models that they had developed to reflect what happens when the lungs, which is the primary focal point, if you will, of what happens in patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, but ultimately the impact is kind of throughout the entire body. But essentially, we started off working in these large animal models, so working in, for example, pig models or sheep models, and looking at, hey, if acute lung injury occurs in these well-established animal models and we administer Multistem, what happens? And what we saw consistently from those models is that when we administered Multistem in those models, or when the researchers administered Multistem in those models, that there was a clear impact on enhancing recovery. So, and as we characterized that mechanistically, again, over years of work, we showed that that was because these cells were going to the lungs, or in some cases other parts of the body, and downregulating the hyperinflammatory cascade and upregulating these various mechanisms and cell types that were helping the body recover from the original incident. And then once we had done some work in multiple models, and we presented that at leading scientific conferences, we were approached by other groups and some clinical groups that said, hey, we want to work with you in an area that's very challenging in the field of lung transplantation. And so we were actually approached by some of the leading specialists. We've had the privilege to work with the top 3 leading lung transplant centers here in the United States, the Cleveland Clinic, which is right up the street from us, Methodist down in Houston, and also UPMC in Pittsburgh, which is really kind of the birthplace, if you will, of many of the key developments in solid organ transplantation, thanks to Dr. Starzl and his team many, many years ago. And so these researchers presented us with a problem that they had been struggling with for many, many years, which is if they needed to perform a lung transplant for a patient because they had severely compromised lung function and there was no other way to deal with it, the problem is that they would have to wait for a suitable donor to emerge. So typically with somebody that would be tragically killed in a trauma or a car accident or other things that might happen, and would have to have consented previously to be an organ donor. And then they would harvest the lungs from that consenting organ donor and then transplant those lungs into a matched recipient. But the problem is that that's not an instantaneous process. First off, you have to have patients kind of at the ready, and then when a donor emerges, you have to be able to efficiently harvest the lungs and then prep for the transplant. And that whole process can take a fair amount of time. And these lung transplant specialists came to us and they said, look, we have a problem. 75% of the time when we've isolated lungs that we could transplant into somebody that needs a lung transplant, the lungs are showing severe inflammation and they become compromised before we can actually do the transplant process. And they said, we think, based on the work you've done with Multistem in these animal models, that if we perfuse these donor lungs with Multistem, that we might be able to save these lungs, and that would allow us to do more transplants and help many more of these patients. Because as you can imagine, it's terribly frustrating for them and for the patient to get all teed up to do a transplant procedure only to realize that, you know what, the lungs have already started to become too inflamed. We can't do the transplant because that would essentially be like giving the patient ARDS. And you can't do that because then you're basically putting them immediately into critical care. You've got to put them on a ventilator in the ICU, and that's just, you know, that's a bad outcome for everyone. So we said, okay, we'd love to work with you in that regard. And so we worked with them to support a program, an experiment, essentially a research program, where they were taking donor lungs that had already started to become highly inflamed, had already lost their capacity to achieve normal oxygenation, because when the lungs become inflamed, the alveoli walls become thickened, and the lungs, the alveoli themselves actually become filled with fluid. It's a process referred to clinically as edema, and then they can't absorb oxygen normally anymore. So basically, what they did was they said, okay, we're going to take one side of the lungs and we're going to perfuse them with Multistem, and the other side we're going to perfuse with saline, so actually down into the lung tissue, and then we're going to see what happens. And as it turns out, the sides that were treated with Multistem showed dramatic ability to actually recover. It dramatically reduced the inflammation and improved the oxygenation efficiency of the lungs. And so they, after conducting the study, they came to us and said, hey, we'd like to actually run a clinical trial where we start perfusing donor lungs with Multistem before we actually do these transplants, because we think that will dramatically improve the odds of success, and it will allow us to save many more lungs and treat many more patients. And we thought very carefully about that, and we decided ultimately that clinically it might make more sense. So fortunately or unfortunately, there's a limited number of lung transplants that are done every year in the United States. It's somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 lung transplants based on my recollection of what the numbers were going back several years ago. And so we consulted with the clinical experts and internally and thought about it, and we decided, you know what, maybe it would be better for us to go after patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, because it's the exact same phenomenon. The lungs are becoming highly inflamed, the patient's not able to get enough oxygen because the alveoli become inflamed and thickened, and the lungs have started to fill with fluid. So what if we focus on treating patients with ARDS? That affects a lot more people in the United States and around the world every single year, because ARDS can be caused by a whole range of different things. It can be triggered by influenza, or as we're seeing now throughout the world, it can be triggered by coronavirus, like with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. We've seen it previously with things like MERS and the original SARS strain that emerged a few years ago. It can be caused by trauma. Actually, trauma results in acute respiratory distress syndrome in a meaningful number of patients, and it can be caused by a range of other things that create this hyperinflammatory environment in the lungs that ultimately forces the patient to be placed on a ventilator. So we made the decision that we were going to go after ARDS as a first clinical target, because it affects many more people, and we thought that might provide a transition ultimately into the lung transplant space, as we've been discussing with these specialists. And we ran a clinical trial, an exploratory phase 2 study that was randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. And sure enough, this data showed that when we treated patients with a single dose of Multistem within the first few days after they had been diagnosed with ARDS and placed on a ventilator, that when they were treated with Multistem, there was a very substantial reduction in mortality, There was an improvement, very rapid improvement in many patients in lung function or pulmonary function. In fact, just to give you kind of one example of that, 45% of the patients that had very serious ARDS that were treated with Multistem were off the ventilator within 7 days or less. Whereas under best available standard of care, only about 20% of the patients could actually achieve that. So we were seeing this very rapid improvement in lung function among these patients. We saw a corresponding dramatic shift in terms of the number of ventilator-free days and also ICU-free days for these patients. And then very encouragingly, in the early part of this year, we completed the one-year follow-up results from the trial, which showed that when patients were treated with Multistem, there was a dramatic improvement in terms of their quality of life in the weeks and months and one-year period where we followed them up after they had been treated either with Multistem or with placebo. The patients that got treated with Multistem were doing much, much better in that one-year follow-up than the patients that were treated with saline, which was the alternative under best available standard of care. Everybody was blinded throughout the one-year assessment, the one-year follow-up, so neither the patients, the doctors, or anybody else knew who got what until after the study was completed. This was really the first time that in a long time where anybody was able to show, hey, we can have an impact on treating ARDS patients for which the mortality rate is very, very high and for which standard of care is very limited. And basically the clinical solution historically for many years has been get the patient on the ventilator, keep them on the ventilator for as long as possible until you can actually help the patient turn the corner, and then wean them from the ventilator and then hope that they get on a reasonable path to recovery. So the fact that we actually made such a significant difference where we dramatically reduced mortality and improved lung function and improved on hospitalization parameters was very exciting. And it resulted in our third fast track designation from the FDA, along with stroke and one other clinical program, which was very encouraging to a lot of people. And ever since then, we've been moving very quickly and have now actually gotten FDA authorization to conduct a pivotal study for treating ARDS patients, specifically for COVID-19 induced ARDS. And so we've been very focused on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we could talk about that. So, I mean, it's clear, the work that you've done on ARDS. I mean, that the evidence so far, that was still in a sort of a fairly small sort of patient group. So it wasn't.
Yeah, it was an exploratory
statistically powered. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an exploratory phase 2 study. It wasn't really constructed for statistical validation. It was really more constructed to say, hey, are we getting a consistent pattern of evidence of improvement and recovery and the patients getting better? And clearly we achieved that, and the FDA agreed with that, which is why they gave us fast track designation and have worked with us to actually get this pivotal study authorized so that we could move forward on that front.
So with the COVID-19, because clearly, ARDS is one of the sort of the big challenges with COVID-19 patients. Could you sort of just describe the sort of management discussions, as the pandemic was emerging, and you realised that you were sitting on a potential sort of therapeutic solution to a problem that was sort of gripping the world.
Yeah, well, it was kind of interesting the way it unfolded. So we were actively preparing. So we announced our one-year follow-up results from our study in mid-January. It was out at the annual JP Morgan conference out in San Francisco, which now seems like eons ago, basically. But it was shortly after that we made the announcement about the very exciting one-year outcome results in quality of life improvement among patients that were treated with Multistem after being treated with ARDS, that we got an inquiry and an invitation to actually meet with the leadership at BARDA. And the leadership at BARDA had correctly anticipated that what was going on in China was in all likelihood going to have a global impact or an impact here in the United States, which is really what they're kind of focused on, as well as many other countries around the world. And of course, we've seen it is now a global phenomenon. We're all living with it in ways that I think none of us could really envision or imagine even a few months ago. So we got this invitation from BARDA, who reached out to us and said, hey, we're concerned that this might be headed our way. We've actually been looking for a number of years for therapeutic interventions that might actually be relevant for treating patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome. And frankly, nothing has emerged that has shown that it can actually help in this kind of a situation. And so when we saw the results from your program and the fact that the FDA had given you fast track designation last year, just a few months ago, And the more recent one-year follow-up data, they actually became very interested in that because they realized, you know what, this might actually be an important part of an overall strategy for helping us deal with not only COVID-19 induced ARDS, but one of the things that I think the leadership at BARDA recognized was that this is likely to happen again. We've already seen it happen over the past few years. It happened with SARS, with MERS, with H1N1, which was the particularly nasty strain of the flu, all of which were resulting in patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, patients becoming critically ill, many patients that died. But obviously this time around with COVID-19, it's happening on a scale that is just, frankly, none of us could imagine this even a few months ago. And so they reached out to us and said, hey, we'd like to have a conversation with you about potentially collaborating with you and supporting your efforts to advance this program. And we've been engaged in that process actually over the past few months, which has been in some ways an encouraging exercise and in some ways kind of a frustrating exercise because things haven't actually been culminated exactly the way that we were hoping it would. We thought we would already be through the process and done to this point. It's still ongoing, so I can't actually provide a lot of detailed comment on that. I can say that there's been a lot of focus on development of vaccines. There's been a focus on development of antivirals. All of that's appropriate. And also development on diagnostics and other things, supportive technologies. Our belief is that our technology is really one of a very limited set of things or number of things that has shown real clinical promise in dealing with patients that are seriously or critically ill with ARDS. And that is the leading cause of death. I mean, here in the United States, we've now seen about 145,000 patients as of this date that have died from COVID-19. And the vast, vast majority of those patients have died from COVID-19 induced ARDS and related complications that we believe we can help effectively treat. And around the world, of course, the numbers are much, much bigger. And so it's been a very, on the one hand, it's gratifying to know that we have a technology that we believe can help a lot of patients. It's a little bit frustrating that we can't get things to move faster because of some of the entities that we're dealing with, and in some cases it might be political constraints, in other cases it might just be bureaucratic inefficiencies or other things that are basically getting in the way of this. But the reality of it is we're as convinced as we've ever been that our technology can help a lot of patients, can really make a difference for these patients that are becoming seriously or critically ill, and help them and by extension their families. And so we're committed to that, and we're doing as much as we possibly can to advance this program in the most efficient way possible and to make a difference.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, there's some sort of delays, because I mean, one of the things that's been absolutely remarkable about the response to COVID-19 and the way that industry has sort of mobilized, and in fact the regulators have been pragmatic. We've seen the sort of the speed of sort of development needs, vaccines, repurposing drugs, etc. So it's interesting you're sort of saying that there are still some frustrations around certain delays. And I'm just wondering, is there, as a management team, was there anything that you would maybe do differently that could have maybe sort of alleviated some of that frustration?
Well, I think some of the things that have been most frustrating for us are things that we just have no control over. I'll give you a couple of good examples. So, we've gotten obviously very deep into this process in terms of our discussions and our interactions with BARDA. One of the things that we couldn't have anticipated was that politically there was a decision made to say, hey, we're going to set up this other parallel effort, Operation Warp Speed, or we're going to set up this other initiative called Active, or we're going to let the NIH basically assume governance or jurisdiction over some of the things that are being done. And so at times it's kind of felt to a lot of people like we're not really sure who's in charge or who's making the decisions on some of these things. And for example, one of the things that happened a few weeks ago was when there was a decision and an announcement made that BARDA was no longer going to be focused on immunomodulatory therapies. I know that in some segments that decision is now being questioned and reconsidered. The reality of it is that it doesn't just make sense to only focus on vaccines or on certain types of interventions that are not actually focused on the patients that are becoming seriously or critically ill, particularly when those technologies have already shown the potential to help patients and there is no effective standard of care for those types of individuals. So I think the political pieces that have been moving around, the institutional pieces that have been moving around, honestly, there was no way we could anticipate the way some of that stuff might unfold, whether it be things like changes in leadership at organizations like BARDA or other things that might be happening. The reality of it is that we've been doing our best to make sure that we're continuing to advance this, that we're putting ourselves in the best possible position to be part of the solution set. And it's not, honestly, because we're looking to make money off this for that particular opportunity. In fact, we've already said we're not focused on it for that reason. We're focused on doing this simply because we were asked to get engaged in a process, which we did, and essentially because we believe we can help based on the data. And a lot of other people out there that have thoroughly reviewed what we're doing are also convinced that we can help. And now our objective is just to see this to fruition so that we can actually be in a position to make a difference and really help these patients.
So, I mean, one of the things where, talking about speed, back, I think back in April, you announced that you were going to raise $58 million, or you're going to raise some money in a public offering. You were able to raise $58 million, and you closed that a week after the original announcement. And yet this was a time when there's like social distancing, etc. So what were the sort of the challenges associated with that fundraising, and what was it that you were telling investors that you were going to actually do with the money?
Well, so first off, some of the challenges related to doing a financing in that kind of an environment. Nobody knew for sure whether or not financings were even going to be possible. The reality of it is that typically you have the opportunity when you're doing a financing where you meet face-to-face with many of the potential participants, the institutional fund managers or others. Of course, none of that was possible back in mid-April because there were statewide shutdowns in effect for many, many different regions. And in fact, it was essentially becoming a national phenomenon. So it had to be done in an entirely different way. So we had to work with our banking team and others to kind of think about, well, what's the best way for us to approach something like this? And thankfully, it was actually a very smooth and efficient process at the end of the day. And so it came to a successful outcome. As a result of that, our company is now in the strongest financial position that we've ever been in our history as a public biotechnology company. So we're in a very good position. We're able to actually continue moving forward in, I think, all the most important ways that we're really focused on. The financing was actually a big part of that. And we're very thankful for the people that looked at what we are doing. And as it gets to what we told people we were going to do with the proceeds, it's exactly what we've been doing since we completed the financing, and frankly, what we were doing beforehand, which is advance our clinical programs, continue to mature and expand our capabilities in core areas. We're actively preparing for making a transition that, frankly, few biotechnology companies have been able to make, which is to become a full-blown commercial company. And so we brought on new members of the leadership team. We had a new CFO actually join us in the early part of the year, who has extensive experience, McLeod, in terms of product commercialization, product launch, a whole bunch of other things. We had another addition to the team, Maya Hansen, who joined us from McKinsey, who became our senior VP of operations and supply chain. And she is responsible for working with the other members of our very experienced and committed leadership team to really help us prepare for this transition to becoming a full-blown commercial company. And I personally am as convinced as I've ever been that we're going to be able to make this transition successfully, that we're going to be able to achieve the kind of success that I think few companies in our industry have been able to achieve. And in some cases, we will continue to partner with outside companies. We're actively engaged in that process with multiple companies as we speak and have been for some time. I think that can help us in some geographies and in some areas, or even potentially on a broader geographic basis in the context of the right partnership. But the point is that we're doing all the things we need to do to be able to achieve that kind of success. And the financing was a big part of that. So I think that we're doing exactly what we told investors we were going to do. We remain committed and focused to achieving those goals and objectives and continuing to advance our programs and our key initiatives.
Yeah, I saw the recent hires, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you are building a highly experienced, pharmaceutical board around you, sort of, the management team. So
yeah, we're excited about that. I mean, frankly, and the reason why people are willing to leave some of these other leading organizations and become part of our team is because they look at what we have and they say, this is a company that has the potential to make a transformational maybe once in a generation or once in a lifetime kind of opportunity in terms of advancing medicine for patients that are seriously and critically ill and where current standard of care is inherently limited. And they want to be part of that because they see that, you know what, if I was part of an organization that accomplished something like that and did so much good for so many patients and was able to generate a benefit for shareholders in the process, frankly, that's something that we could all look back on as a set of legacy accomplishments and say, you know, if I did nothing else in my life, I'm tremendously proud of what I was able to accomplish on those fronts. And I think that's exactly what we're positioned to achieve. It's not going to be easy. At times it takes longer than we want it to. And there's a lot of things that problems or hurdles crop up and we have to deal with them or kind of manage around them. But the reality of it is that we have a very highly talented and very experienced team that is relentlessly determined to accomplishing our goals. And we're not going to give up until we actually make that happen.
Yeah, so you described this, you know, the ambition, but you also mentioned the hurdles. What, as a management team, and this is my final question,
Sure.
and it's probably therefore the hardest. You know, what are sort of the biggest leadership challenges that you currently face as you try to make that transition from, you know, a clinical stage company to actually a fully fledged commercial entity?
Well, I think it's something that I'm actually quite proud of is that we've always had an organization that is able to assess what we know, what we don't know, and objectively take a look at how we actually figure out what we need to solve for so that we can get to that next level. And I think that keeping one challenge that all organizations face, and certainly is something that we face as well, is keeping people focused and not minimizing the distraction, if you will, particularly when there's a lot of chaos going on around you. I mean, as you can imagine, the chaos that we're all living with right now, and I know you're living with it as well in your team, it doesn't just impact our work lives, it impacts our personal lives, and it impacts a lot of things going on around us. And so we have to make adjustments for that, and we have to help each other out. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is that we have a culture where people really care about one another and they really care about what we're doing. They're deeply, passionately committed to that. And so we are working together to try and solve for things that address challenges or problems that we couldn't even imagine a few months ago. But that doesn't mean it's always easy. I mean, the reality of it is that there's lots of things that come up. It might be technical issues, it might be operational issues, it might just be, you know, frankly, psychological issues where people are beginning to feel a bit worn down, and sometimes the challenge feels like it's maybe a bit too much for them. And so keeping people inspired, keeping people motivated. The great thing is that our company knows that we have a very unique opportunity to really make a difference, to improve medicine for patients that desperately need help. That is incredibly motivating for people. And so as long as they continue to keep that in their minds and really part of their core set of objectives, they understand why they're doing what they're doing, why it's so important, and they really remain relentlessly determined to bring our vision of the future of medicine to a reality. But again, working with them to help smooth the path, if you will, can sometimes be a challenging exercise, and so we're all working together to try and make that happen.
Yeah. So Gil, look, I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating. So, you know, thanks very much. You know, and particularly, you know, that work that you're doing, you know, in the ARD space, you know, particularly for COVID-19 patients, you know, we'll all be, you know, watching that very, very closely, and you know, you've got everybody's best wishes.
Well, Mike, thank you so much. I really enjoyed spending time with you and having the chance to talk about what we're doing. I wish you and your family all the best, and all your colleagues, and just encourage everybody to be cautious, wear a mask, stay safe, and do what you need to do, and we'll get through this.
Yeah, so great messages. So if after listening to this broadcast, you'd like to tune into future episodes of Conversations in Healthcare, follow our LinkedIn page, because that's where we're going to be posting alerts to future releases. So in closing, I'd like to thank Gil again for joining us, and thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.